Hello, everyone. My name is Sherry Claire, and I'm a biologist with one of the owners of Fiera Biological Consulting. In 2024, my firm was retained by Leica to complete a State of the Watershed assessment for the Beaver River watershed, which we completed in the spring of 2025. And today I'm going to walk you through what a State of the Watershed assessment is, the approach we use to assess the current state of the Beaver River watershed, as well as some of the major findings and conclusions from the State of the Watershed assessment. But first, I want to start out by talking about what makes the Beaver River watershed special and why it's important in our lives. The Beaver River watershed is located in east central Alberta, with a major part of the watershed extending into Saskatchewan. Unlike other major river watersheds in Alberta, the Beaver River watershed does not receive any runoff from the Rocky Mountains, and it's the only watershed in the province that is part of the Churchill River system. Like all watersheds, the Beaver River watershed is made up of successively smaller and nested watersheds. These watersheds are referred to as HUC watersheds, with HUC standing for Hydrologic Unit Code, which is a numeric system of identifying and ordering watersheds. In this HUC system, the largest watershed units are HUC 2 and the smallest watershed units are HUC 10. And the Beaver River watershed is a HUC 2 watershed. Within Alberta, the Beaver River watershed is divided into 5 smaller HUC 6 watersheds, 2 of which, the Martineau River Cold Lake and the Lower Beaver River watershed, extend into Saskatchewan. And each HUC 6 watershed is further divided into 13 smaller HUC 8 watersheds. And the Beaver River watershed is important because it provides us with clean water, and these waters are essential for sustaining functional ecosystems that in turn support healthy plants and wildlife populations. And all of these things, clean water, functioning ecosystems, and healthy wildlife populations, are essential to our own health, happiness, and well-being. Because healthy watersheds support things like recreation and our economy and our livelihoods. And the Beaver River watershed has been an important place for people, not just since European settlement, but for millennia. The Beaver River watershed lies within the traditional territories of 6 First Nation communities, 2 of which are shown here, and 4 Métis settlements. Today, more than 5,000 Indigenous people call the Beaver River watershed home. And because we all rely on the Beaver River watershed, it's important that we understand its current state and how this state might be changing due to natural and human drivers. And so in 2024, Leica commissioned a State of the Watershed assessment to gather Indigenous knowledge and the most comprehensive and unbiased science available to better understand the pressures on and the current condition of the rivers, lakes, wetlands, and wildlife in the region. A State of the Watershed assessment is something that is periodically done by watershed planning and advisory councils. And the objective of these assessments is to improve our understanding of how natural features and processes influence watershed conditions. A State of the Watershed assessment should also provide insights into the linkages between watershed conditions and human land and water use, with the goal of identifying priority watershed risks. For this State of the Watershed assessment, we used a Driver Pressure State Impact Response, or DPSIR, framework. The DPSIR framework integrates information in a way that allows for the identification of interactions and linkages between the drivers and pressures that cause environmental change, and the impacts those changes have, and the response by society to those changes. Within this framework, a driver is a natural or human force that causes environmental change and is generally considered to be a complex phenomenon that's beyond the direct control of management. This includes natural drivers such as climate and geology, and human drivers such as economic, social, or political demands. Pressure includes the stressors that human activities or natural conditions put on the watershed that result from one or more driver. State is the actual condition of the watershed and its ecological or hydrological components that emerge from the exertion of one or more pressure. Often we can directly measure or monitor the state or condition of a given watershed component, or we can evaluate how the state has changed over time using both Western science and traditional knowledge. Impact is the direct and indirect consequences of environmental change on ecosystems and on people. And response includes the management actions that are put into place to reduce or prevent an unwanted change or to create a positive change in the watershed. This can include target setting, prioritization of areas for restoration or conservation, or new policies or changes to regulation that prevent or minimize pressures, or that maintain or restore the state of the environment. And often a response is directed at human activities that are exerting pressure on environmental components of the watershed, although a response can also be directed towards other components within this framework. So to provide an example of how this framework can be used to understand change in the watershed, consider food production as a driver. Our need for food drives the conversion of natural habitats like wetlands and forests into agricultural land such as pasture and cropland. And this land conversion often leads to an increase in the amount of sediment and nutrients flowing off the agricultural lands and into streams and lakes, which can reduce water quality. And the reduction in water quality can result in things like toxic blue-green algae blooms in lakes, which increases the risk to human health for people who live near the lakes or who use the lakes for recreation. One possible management response to this type of pressure is to develop a habitat restoration program that's aimed at restoring riparian vegetation on agricultural lands to increase natural filtration, with the goal of reducing sediment and nutrient loading to surface waters. It's important to note that a single driver and pressure may cause more than one issue in a watershed. So in this example, food production and agricultural land use could also contribute to a decline in fish populations, which in turn may impact recreational fishing opportunities. And one example of a management response could be to implement a fish stocking program to supplement fish populations. These examples illustrate how the DPSIR framework can be used to organize, clarify, and formalize cause and effect relationships between human activities and the environment. And importantly, this framework can be used to connect outcomes from the State of the Watershed Assessment with commitments in the Beaver River Integrated Watershed Management Plan, which was written in 2022. For this State of the Watershed Assessment, we used a comprehensive list of driver, pressure, and state indicators and metrics to evaluate the current state of the watershed. And all of those indicators and metrics that we evaluated are listed here. I don't have time today to present all of the results from the State of the Watershed Assessment, and so instead I want to focus on what I consider to be a few of the priority risks to the watershed that we identified as part of this assessment. And I want to start out by talking about water, and specifically how climate and climate change, along with the use of water for food production, energy development, and drinking by humans, all influence where and how much water is available in the watershed today, as well as into the future. Climate is the general pattern of weather that we see in a particular place over a period of about 30 years. And it's an important driver of where the water is in the watershed and how much is available. In turn, the amount of water that's available impacts how many plants, animals, and fish there are and where they live. It also influences where communities and industries develop. Climate in the Beaver River watershed has historically been characterized by short, cool summers and long, cold winters. Where you are in the watershed also matters. There's a strong north-south temperature gradient, with average annual temperatures in the southern part of the watershed being nearly 2 degrees warmer than temperatures in the north. We also know that climate is variable, and one of the most important natural drivers of annual and decadal variability in the climate of the watershed is something called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or PDO. The PDO is a long-term climate pattern that's driven by changes in the surface water temperature of the Pacific Ocean. And these changes drive weather patterns across North America. The important thing to know about the PDO is that every 20 or 30 years, it shifts between a warm and a cool phase, although more recently, these cycles have accelerated. Alberta is positively correlated with PDO index values, and this means that we have warm and dry climatic conditions when PDO index values are positive, and cool and wet climatic conditions when PDO index values are negative. And as you can see from this graph and the corresponding map, PDO index values are currently negative, which means we are in a cool and wet phase. And in fact, PDO values have been consistently negative since January of 2020, with values reaching a record low in July of 2025. The PDO cycle is important when we think about water availability because the amount of precipitation that falls in the Beaver River watershed is influenced by the current phase of the PDO. This is illustrated by the trend line in this figure, which shows the average amount of precipitation that fell each year in the watershed since the early 1900s. And you can see that this trend line rises and falls along with the wet and dry cycles of the PDO, which is shown at the top of the graph. This figure also shows that on average, annual precipitation in the watershed has generally been increasing over the last decade. And this wet phase is expected to continue until the end of the 2030s. The general increase in precipitation over the last decade is reflected in the amount of surface water that is being stored in lakes and open water wetlands, which we can measure using satellite imagery. Here you can see that in 2012, the amount of water stored in lakes and wetlands was at its lowest measured value since 1984. But since around 2012, water storage has generally been increasing across the watershed. And this generally corresponds to that cool and wet phase of the PDO. A similar pattern of increasing water storage in lakes is also confirmed by Water Survey of Canada lake level measurement data. Here you can see the water levels in Mini and Muriel Lake, which have been generally increasing since around 2017, which is indicated by those little arrows. But what's also important to note about these graphs is that despite the general increase in water levels in these lakes over the past decade, the water levels are still below average, which is shown by the dotted line. And so this raises the question of why we're seeing water levels that are below the historic average in some of the lakes within the watershed, despite being in a cool, wet phase of the PDO. And part of the reason for this may be location. As you can see from this map, precipitation is not uniform across the watershed, with some areas receiving more or less precipitation on average than others. And the south central part of the watershed, where both Mini and Muriel Lakes are located, receives less annual precipitation on average than other parts of the watershed. But another explanation for below average lake levels is climate change, which has been and is expected to continue to exert significant pressure on the ecological and hydroclimatic conditions of the watershed. Since the 1970s, the average annual temperature across Alberta has warmed by approximately 1.5 degrees. And compared to the rest of the province, the Beaver River watershed has experienced a greater warming trend, with average temperatures increasing by approximately 2.5 degrees since the beginning of the century. And these increasing temperatures are acting to offset the increase in precipitation because as temperatures increase, so too does the rate of evaporation and transpiration. And human activities that produce greenhouse gas emissions are expected to drive even more climate warming over the next century. How much additional warming we should expect is difficult to know precisely because it's dependent on how much additional greenhouse gas is released into the atmosphere. And so various global climate models have been developed based on high and low emission scenarios. For all emission scenarios considered, temperatures in the Beaver River watershed in both the summer and the winter are expected to increase, with increases projected to be between 2 and 8 degrees in the summer and between 1 and 6 degrees on average in the winter. Precipitation is also expected to increase in both summer and winter. While precipitation in the summer is projected to increase by between 1 and 7%, this increase will be in part offset by the corresponding increase in temperature, which is expected to result in decreasing soil moisture. The projected increase in precipitation in the winter is fairly substantial, with estimates ranging between 7 and 30%. But much of the additional winter precipitation is expected to fall as rain rather than snow, with a predicted reduction in the amount of precipitation falling as snow over the winter months of between 6 and 31%. This reduction in snow is likely to impact water availability since winter snowpack is critical for supplying the spring meltwater that recharges groundwater, fills lakes and wetlands, and replenishes soil moisture. And all of this combined is expected to increase the risk of more severe and frequent drought conditions, which could lead to water shortages that negatively impact agricultural crops and natural vegetation, as well as wildlife, livestock, and people. More frequent drought will also likely contribute to more frequent and severe wildfires. Another major driver of water use in the watershed is the human demand for drinking water. The Beaver River watershed is home to over 40,000 people, and with increasing population comes increasing demand for safe and secure drinking water from both surface and groundwater sources. Agriculture is also a major user of surface and groundwater in the watershed, with most of the water being used for irrigation of crops or as drinking water for livestock. Another major driver of water use in the watershed is the human demand for energy. The Cold Lake region, including the Beaver River watershed, overlies the second largest deposit of oil sands in the province. Most of the reserves are held in deposits that are between 300 and 600 meters below the surface, making the bitumen too deep to recover using surface mining techniques. Instead, the bitumen in these deep deposits is recovered using in situ technology, including steam-assisted gravity drainage and cyclic steam stimulation, both of which rely on large quantities of water. Water use for all of these various purposes is regulated in Alberta under the Water Act. Under this system, the government allocates surface and groundwater use on an annual basis through a licensing system. The system allocates a specified amount of water each year, and this is the maximum amount of water the license holder is allowed to use. But we have an incomplete picture of how much of the allocated water is actually used. While water use for some large and medium license holders is reported, not all license holders are required to report their water use. And for some uses of water that are below a certain volume, a license isn't needed. So while we have a pretty good handle on the maximum amount of water that could be used in a given year and how much allocation amounts change over time, we have an incomplete picture of how much water is actually being used in a given year. As part of this state of the watershed assessment, we looked at water allocation data that's available from the Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Protected Areas for 2022 and 2023. This included data on surface water allocations, which includes water that's taken from lakes, rivers, reservoirs, and surface runoff, as well as allocation data for shallow groundwater, which includes water in sediments within 150 meters of the ground surface. In 2022 and 2023, about 86% of all of the water allocated in the watershed came from surface water sources. The total amount of surface water that was allocated in the watershed was similar in 2022 and 2023 at about 53 million cubic meters. To put this number in perspective, that's approximately 53 billion liters of water, which would fill around 21,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And as this table illustrates, those allocations were not uniform across the watershed. Approximately 63% of the allocated surface water was in two Huck 8 watersheds. This included the Middle Beaver River watershed, which accounted for approximately 22% of the allocations, and the Medley River and Cold Lake watershed, which accounted for 41% of all of the surface water allocations across the Beaver River watershed. And between 2022 and 2023, surface water allocations increased for nearly all of the Huck 8 watersheds. But the most notable increases occurred in the Sand River, Canoe Lake, and Wolf River watersheds, where the increase in allocation ranged between 14 and 39%. In contrast, there was a decrease in allocations in the Murray Creek and the Middle Beaver River Huck 8 watersheds. Trying to put these numbers into perspective can be a bit difficult, and one way to better understand what all of this allocation data means is to compare the amount of water that's allocated for use to the estimated amount of water that's available for use, as this allows for the identification of areas that have the potential to be water constrained. This map shows how much surface water was allocated in each Huck 8 watershed as a percentage of the total amount that was predicted to be available. And for most of the watersheds, less than 10% of the available surface water was allocated for use in 2022 and 2023. But in the Moose Lake, Middle Beaver River, and the Medley River and Cold Lake watersheds, over 20% of the available surface water was allocated. We can also look at shallow groundwater allocations in the watershed for 2022 and 2023, which amounted to just under 9 million cubic meters in both years. And similar to what we saw with surface water, groundwater allocations are also not uniform across the watershed. About 74% of the allocated groundwater came from only 3 Huck 8 watersheds. And these Huck 8 watersheds are generally associated with areas that have thick subsurface bitumen layers. Between 2022 and 2023, there was either a decrease or no change in allocations for most of the Huck 8 watersheds. There was, however, a fairly substantial increase in groundwater allocation for the Amisk River watershed and a notable decrease in allocation for the Sand River watershed. While this water allocation information is helpful for understanding potential water use, it's difficult to evaluate without considering how much water is typically available for use in any given year. So similar to the surface water map I showed earlier, this map shows the allocation to availability for shallow groundwater. And you can see here that for the Canoe Lake watershed, more than 100% of the available groundwater was allocated for use in 2022 and 2023. As mentioned previously, the amount of shallow groundwater that has been allocated represents the maximum amount that could be taken as compared to the average hydrologic conditions. And in most years, these rates are never reached. The AER does have data from 2022 and 2023 on the reported use of non-saline shallow groundwater for in situ energy production in the Beaver River watershed. And this data gives some insight into the volumes of groundwater that are being used for oil and gas production in the watershed. For the Canoe Lake watershed, 53% of the water that was allocated was reportedly used, with reported use for each of the other watersheds ranging between 1 and 18%. This shows that in the years for which we have data, the amount of groundwater that was used was less than what was allocated for use. The next thing I want to discuss is how land is used in the watershed to grow food, produce energy, and to support growing communities, and the pressures that those different land uses put on habitat and wildlife in the watershed. Land use change driven by human activity can place direct and indirect pressures on ecosystems, water quality, and wildlife, and is one of the primary threats to biodiversity worldwide. The things we do on the landscape, like agriculture, residential development, and industrial development, all create something that we refer to as human footprint. And the total amount and the configuration of human footprint is commonly measured and tracked as a general indicator of impacts to habitat and wildlife. Agriculture is one type of human land use that can result in significant changes to habitat because it involves conversion of natural habitat to agricultural land, such as crop or pasture. In particular, agricultural land use is often associated with the drainage and loss of wetland habitat. Just under 19% of the Beaver River watershed is covered by pasture or cropland, and most of the agricultural lands are in the southern portion of the watershed, where the soil or growing conditions are most favorable. In terms of oil and gas production, surface well sites represent one type of human footprint that's associated with the human demand for energy. And as of October 2024, there were nearly 33,000 active, inactive, or reclaimed surface wells in the watershed. The density of active wells, which are those classified as issued, amended, or re-entered, is highest in the central portion of the watershed. Most notably, the Jackfish Creek Huckate watershed, which is highlighted on the map to the right with an asterisk, has nearly 3 times the density of active wells than any other Huckate watershed, with a surface well density of just over 6 wells per square kilometer. Similarly, the highest density of inactive surface wells is also in the central portion of the watershed. These are wells that have been suspended or abandoned and have not yet been certified as reclaimed. Surface wells are also associated with other types of human footprint, including linear features such as roads, seismic lines, and pipelines. And linear features can greatly extend development into natural habitats where they have direct ecological effects, as well as indirect effects, because these features have a zone of influence that extends beyond the actual footprint. Some of the impacts of linear features include disturbances to soils and vegetation, shifts in plant species composition, changes to water quality and flow regimes, and impacts to fish and wildlife populations. Typically, linear feature density is the measure used to assess impacts, with many scientific studies documenting negative impacts to fish and wildlife when linear feature densities exceed 1 kilometer per kilometer squared. In the Beaver River watershed, the combined density of all linear feature types, which includes roads, pipelines, seismic lines, power lines, and rail lines, is quite high, with all but 3 of the Huckate watersheds having densities that exceed 3 kilometers per square kilometer. Only one watershed has a linear feature density below 1 kilometer per kilometer squared. When all types of human footprint is combined and considered together, over 25% of the Beaver River watershed is covered by some kind of human footprint. The highest concentration of human footprint is in the Moose Lake and Middle Beaver River watersheds, where human footprint covers more than 50% of those Huckate watersheds. Human land use that creates human footprint results in the loss of natural cover, including both terrestrial cover like forests and aquatic cover like wetlands. Data tracking loss of habitat between 2010 and 2021 tells us that in some parts of the watershed, nearly 3% of terrestrial habitat has been lost, with wetland losses being lower, but still exceeding 1% in many areas. Areas with the greatest ongoing loss of habitat are in the central and southern portions of the watershed. This loss of natural habitat has impacted traditional foraging, hunting, and trapping areas for Indigenous peoples, with plants and wildlife species that were previously abundant no longer being present in the same places or numbers. These lived experiences of Indigenous peoples are consistent with the species modeling data that we have for the watershed, which shows us that the estimated change in the current and historical relative abundance of different animals. On these maps, the dark brown corresponds with locations where there have been large decreases in abundance. Green shows locations where abundance has increased, and white indicates locations where there has been little or no change. You can see that for black bear, relative abundance has decreased substantially throughout the southern part of the watershed and has also decreased in the northern parts of the watershed in locations associated with energy development. Moose show similar changes in abundance, although the decrease is not as large as it is for black bears. In contrast, there are some species that respond positively to increased habitat disturbance, and this includes coyote, which have increased in abundance in areas that have been disturbed by human development. For species like mule deer, the response to human development is more complex, with abundance increasing in some locations and decreasing in others. The data that we have for fish also suggests that for some species, populations are in decline. This includes lake-dwelling populations of northern pike. The provincial government has sampled northern pike in 62 lakes across the watershed to measure the density of adult fish. For 9 of the lakes sampled, no adult fish were observed during surveys, and these lakes are shown on this map by the black diamonds. Populations in these lakes have been classified as functionally extirpated, which means that while there may still be a few adult individuals remaining, they do not constitute a viable population. A further 13 lakes have very low current adult densities, and these are the lakes shown with red diamonds. And this means that adult fish were barely detectable during surveys, which puts these populations at very high risk of functional extirpation. Another 37 lakes have lower moderate densities of adult fish, which means that these lakes have been overfished and population levels are below the maximum sustainable yield. Only 3 of the lakes, Primrose, Tucker, and Long Lake, have high or very high northern pike adult densities. These results are consistent with Indigenous knowledge, which tells us that there have been declines in the size, abundance, and quality of fish in the watershed that are linked to environmental shifts, human activities, and ecological imbalances. I've thrown a lot of information at you, so before I finish up, I want to quickly summarize the priority risks that were identified in this State of the Watershed assessment. The first is that climate change is forecasted to exert significant pressure on the ecological and hydroclimatic conditions of the Beaver River watershed. Compared to the rest of the province, the Beaver River watershed has experienced a greater warming trend, with average temperatures increasing by approximately 2.5 degrees since the beginning of the century. Estimates also suggest that both summer and winter temperatures will continue to increase through to the year 2100, with winter temperatures expected to increase more than summer temperatures. Additionally, precipitation patterns are expected to change, with more winter precipitation falling as rain rather than snow. These changes could impact water availability and will likely result in an increased risk of more severe and frequent drought conditions. The second priority risk is that the human demand for and use of water in the Beaver River watershed is likely to continue to increase. And this increase will be driven by population growth, recreation, and economic activities such as agriculture and oil and gas. Going forward, It's essential that sufficient volumes of water remain available to support ecosystem function and hydrological processes, particularly under conditions of water scarcity that may be driven by long-term climate cycles and climate change. The third priority risk is that human footprint, and particularly linear disturbance, is extensive throughout the watershed. And this human disturbance is resulting in habitat loss and disturbance that is impacting the abundance and distribution of plants and animals, many of which are culturally important species for Indigenous peoples. Finally, I want to mention water quality, which I have not previously discussed, and that's because our understanding of water quality across the watershed is somewhat limited. While there is some surface water quality data available for the Beaver River watershed, there's a fairly substantial gap in where the sampling happens and how frequently it occurs, and this is particularly true for lakes. Additionally, there is virtually no water quality data for groundwater, which represents a substantial gap in our understanding of the overall water quality across the watershed. In closing, I want to reiterate how vitally important this watershed and its waters are to the function of the ecosystems that sustain the health and well-being of the people and wildlife that live here. And I want to invite you to become involved and to take action to address some of the priority issues that I've highlighted, because the action that we take to help the watershed will have positive effects on our community, the region, and our country for generations to come. And with that, I want to thank you for your interest, and I want to let you know that you can download a copy of the State of the Watershed Assessment by visiting the LICA website. Thanks very much.